Welcome to Dialogs. Today we are talking to Bob Hennessy, based out of Sydney, Australia. He's been associated with technology-enabled business change for over 40 years and worked in executive management roles over the last 23 years as CIO, COO and CEO across 6 industries. Most recently, he had 5 years with Lees as Group CIO and is now a director at BeFound Group. This episode was recorded in July 2020, and our main topic for today, design for manufacturing in the construction industry. Let's go chat with him. Hi Bob, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it. So
good to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you. I know it's late your day, early mine. So yeah, across the time zones. So before we get into your story, which we're looking forward to hearing about, maybe just very quickly the elevator pitch for DFM. What is that, so people can understand what it is?
I was with an owner of a home building business here in Australia. They do about 30,000 homes a year, a private company. And he said to me the other day, he said, I've got a friend who's a manufacturer, and he was explaining to me how even though they bring in parts for their product from all over the world, when they come together, they simply clip them together and they fit perfectly first time. He said, why can't we do that in construction? And manufacturing have been evolving design for manufacture as a discipline for many years, and it is purely about a perfect design that is then used to orchestrate the manufacturing of the components that you then assemble into a finished product. That's design for manufacture. And construction today, broadly as an industry, still rejects the idea that this is something that fits in this industry. But there are many green shoots, and in my view, an inevitability that this is where the industry will go.
Brilliant. Well, that's what today I'm hoping to get into, which we're looking forward to. So your story, Bob. So where in the world do we find you? And maybe just a little bit about how you started, where you grew up, and how you got to where you are today.
How long have you got?
Yeah, all day.
So look, I came into the property and construction industry only in 2015. But my career goes back to 1977 when I started in the steel industry in a heavy steel manufacturer of the type, the Bethlehem Steel, Sheffield Steel that many people would be aware of. But it still works in Port Kembla of similar size complexity. About 23,000 people on the steel plant. And I was born and bred in that town, and that was a place where many people, started their careers. But my career started in software, so I started writing software in 1977, the start of 1977. So that's over 43 years now that I've been in this trade. And I came through, did 11 years in that industry, learned a lot about steel and the steelworks, and learnt how to write software. Probably wrote in 8 or 9 different software languages over that time, and but importantly, though, I was involved in big transformational activities through the 1980s in that steelworks, which largely are why, despite the loss of Bethlehem Steel, Sheffield Steel, comparably complex large steelworks, the Wollongong Steelworks still exists today as a manufacturer of, primary manufacturer of steel, and then secondary products in slab and plate and strip steel. And it was that coming together of technology and the transformation of a business, I guess, laid foundations. Right. At the time, I didn't fully understand the significance of for me, but it probably ended up defining somewhat where I kept going to in my career. So I then landed in transport for about 11 years, transport and distribution. Then fell into banking for about 5 years, banking and financial services. Right. One of the major banks here in Australia, then into telecommunications. I was a COO and a CIO in a telco here, owned by Telecom New Zealand. Then through a management buyout, ended up becoming what I call an accidental entrepreneur and had a business for about 3 years. We then sold off to a Chinese group, got lucky, did reasonably well out of that, and then found my way into property and construction. And I think it's because of the diverse industry experiences pre-coming to this sector that are not common probably 5 years ago, even of people who were coming into this sector, that I immediately saw things that perhaps many who'd lived in the industry for many years did not. Outside of my professional world, I've got lots of kids, had a divorce pretty early. I had 3 kids. We came together with 3 each, so that was interesting at 30. And
6.
We've had one together. And actually, on Saturday last weekend, my 11th grandchild was born. So,
congratulations! Wow,
made quite a mess, and also lots of passions too. I guess I spent my youth kicking soccer balls and hitting tennis balls and cricket balls and golf balls, and played a lot of sport and underachieved in all those sports against my ability. I learned a lot about the difference between talent and achievement and outcomes.
That's right,
and was lucky to grow up with a brother who became a world-class violinist, the only Australian to be even invited to trial as concertmaster of the Berlin Philharmonic, for example. And at 9 years old, he knew his destiny. And so I should have learnt more about what excellence really takes just by living against him. Unfortunately, it took me a little longer in my life to sort of really reflect on that and start to understand.
He's your brother.
The price
Come on.
and the rewards.
Younger brother or older brother? Younger brother or older brother?
Older brother is.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, you're not going to follow.
and quite is quite an icon in the classical music industry here in this country, and it's done very well. Yeah,
brilliant. Well, yeah. So with that, history of coming from the manufacturing and the technology and building these, it makes no wonder that your opinions on this and where and how you've got to coming up with the ideas that you've got. So if we go we talked a little bit about the elevator pitch. If we go a little bit more deeper into DFM, and we talked a little bit earlier that when I was doing my research for this call, I kept on coming up with DFMA and DFM, and these terms were bandied about, but there's differences between them. So maybe you can go into a little bit there about that.
Yeah, look, I think the A is really important. It's almost where the reward for the effort is realised, right? The fact you can design perfect componentry means that rather than the classic mode of construction, which is done with transformative processes, shave a bit off here, add a bit there, using tools that continue to do transformative activity on componentry until final assembly is complete, and even beyond into the redemptive work that gets done as you fix the problems in a construction site, which is a normal part of the process, right? Punch lists, as they call them in the US.
Right. Yeah.
Assembly happens when you don't have to do any more transformative activity. You're simply putting together the componentry. So DFM without the A for me misses the reward, right? The reward is this lower cost, lower skill set requirement to enable an activity that is now putting the Lego together, and so that would be the distinction I'd draw between DFM, DFMA, which is simply that if you get the DFM right and the componentry is all perfectly created, then you can simply assemble, not transform.
And so it just seems like it's all upside. So why? So what are the challenges? Do you think then? Why is this something that is just not so obvious? And why wasn't it done 30, 40 years ago?
It's fascinating, and again, I should say, right, it in a journey like this, of course, there've been others who've influenced my thinking, right? So you get to a point and you own your own thinking, but I do reflect on particularly one guy in Lend-Lease called Doerr Patterson, without whom my thinking would not have probably refined to the point it has. And I needed someone who really understood the industry, and probably also a guy who was my chief architect at Lend-Lease called Richard Ferris. Between the three of us, we spent many hours working our way through these things over the last 4 or 5 years. So the thinking's been influenced. But I think it's like many of the stories we all know, right? We all know that the Swiss invented the digital watch, and yet their watch industry was destroyed by the digital watch, which they did not go on to perfect as a discipline of their own, having envisaged and invented the idea from within their own industry. We all know, Blockbuster said no to Netflix. We all know the Kodak story. So all these things look so obvious in hindsight, right? But in the moment, there are reasons why companies, industries don't see the future, and it's just about the that paradigm of being locked into the way things are, and not being able to kind of step outside of that and see past the current structures in the industry, systems of work in the industry, the belief systems that evolve around the industry. And so in this industry, there's really, really, deeply skilled people in each key discipline area that remain quite fragmented from each other. So the architecture disciplines, many brilliant people. The design discipline, similarly. People who manage construction work, deeply expert people who are the subcontractors that do the work to design and implement the plumbing solutions and the HVAC solutions and the electrical solutions. And they work in a system of work where every day they get up and it is the way it is. And so you have to think outside of the way that operates and look at the industry from end to end to even challenge the idea of how things operate today. But the fact that I design a building now and then I hand that design to a general contractor who then takes that design, and often I'll have given him a three-dimensional model of the building, but he'll reproduce down into paper two-dimensional planning sheets, send them to a plumbing subcontractor who'll take maybe 6 months to design a plumbing solution for a 40 or 50-story high-rise building. But he's done that, and the electrical subcontractor's done the same thing, and the HVAC guys have done the same thing. And of course, what they all do is design solutions that actually don't come together beautifully because they've been designed in splendid isolation. So the industry has a process that it calls clash detection that goes, where's the plumber put a pipe where the HVAC guy wants to put a duct? Right. And they resolve those conflicts. And you can't change that unless you're prepared to take that design process of the plumber and bring it back into the original design process that the design firm are doing.
Right.
But the belief systems in the industry are you don't do that, because if I do that and I tell the plumber what that design is, I can no longer hold him wholly accountable for his work product. And I can't transfer the risk to him that I want to transfer to him, because I, the general contractor, don't want to have that risk on me. I want him to be suable if he gets it wrong. And so to start anywhere in that process chain to try and make this change, and other than at the front, it means right. It's almost impossible to make the change happen. But it's been the enemy, therefore, though, of innovation, because innovation in industries where you've seen transformation, what happens is industries verticalize, right? So they interconnect all the activity from front to back. And you saw this happen, I think, one of my favorite stories, I think, in terms of this, that helps see the change here is the story of the Boeing 777. It was designed in 1988, I think that program started. It turned into the best ever maiden flight of a new commercial aircraft. And that aircraft, and what's often reported, is that aircraft was fully digitally designed, full comprehensive design of the aircraft in every facet. The story that's not so often told, but I think is at least as critical to the success of that project as the digital design, was the fact that the supply chain partners were brought into that design process. And so they owned their component of that design. Right. So collectively, they signed off a design saying, that is what we will do. We will own that. And so then the materials manufactured off the back of that design were manufactured through that coordination across all of those supply chain players to be perfectly matched into a whole design. And therefore, when the pieces were manufactured, they fit. And you have no clash detection in that model because the design is agreed up front. Comprehensive, 100% resolved design is agreed up front. Everybody manufactures off that. And of course, you get those arguments to say, yeah, but they make lots of 777s and we only ever do a building once, so you can't afford the price of that kind of right. investment, in a comprehensive design. And I think that misses. It misses the point, because what it doesn't count is the cost of the rework and redesign and all that other activity that happens off the back of never having invested in getting that one design done right up front.
Right.
So the architect produces a model, the design firm produces a model, the general contractor often produces a model, and each of the subcontractors produce a model. And then the owner says, I want a model. And so they redo a model.
So
and if you look at that, and if you look at the life of data in that value chain, it's ridiculous. In advanced industries, data is created at the front of the process and it gets enriched throughout the process to the end point. Right. In this industry, data is like a sawtooth. It gets created and thrown away, created again and thrown away in each step in the value chain. And so the inefficiencies in that are proven in many industries to be enormous. And it's my thesis is that the first buildings we start to build in this way will actually not have an R&D premium to them, though you will get productivity gains from day one. And I saw similar things happen in other industries, particularly the transport industry. As we introduced technology into depots and so on, people were very worried about the data management load on people. But what we found was very significant productivity gains through the systematization of the work in a designed way. And that's what's being missed here. All of that mess of rework and inefficiency gets lost in a complex ecosystem, and it's hard for people to see unless you get back to 30,000 feet and look down on that end-to-end value chain of work.
That's right. And you touched on it slightly there. Well, you talked about the system of work and the belief structure. Obviously, they're very much intertwined. They drive each other. We talked about the inefficiencies there, management of risk and pushing it down. What other reasons would the industry be giving for not doing it? And the analogy there of the data is something that we thought about at Enstoa, forever, because we're a data-driven company, and the ability, the value of that data, and not having it siloed, even within an organization in its own projects, let alone across the supply chain or across the teams, everybody, all the teams within projects, big or small. What are those other reasons that these the players in the game, in the model, could give for, well, this is just a fad and we've tried it doesn't work, and we're just going to continue to do what we're doing?
There's a lot of ways to come at that question. I'm always really wary of attributing motivation to people for why they do things, right? Because you never really know, right, unless you're them. And even often if you're them, you don't know, because it could be subliminal. But if you think about the value proposition of a construction worker, one of the things that gets them out of bed every day, and you get them talking, is the problem-solving nature of their job. They come to work every day and they crack problems all day, and that's what makes them expert. And so the idea that that's a potentially obsolete skill set because we don't create those problems in the first place is actually offensive. I've had a few conversations that, go down in my Change Management 101 book, right, from people who do not appreciate me suggesting that there's massive productivity opportunity in this industry. They kind of think, well, who are you? Come in here 5 minutes and I'll leave the expletives out, and think that there might be 20 or 30% productivity gains to be made in this industry when we've been at this all our lives. Do you think we're stupid?
Right. And
so they hold on to what they know and to what their value proposition is, and
it's their identity, it's their ideology.
It is, and I don't say it's for some kind of bad reason. I just think it's that conviction that I'm an expert, and so how dare someone suggest that what I know how to do is not value or not the best way.
Right.
And I think we all get out of bed every morning to come and do a good job, right? So I think that, but that's a very powerful force, because if people aren't ready to hear an option, it is blinding. And that whole, the whole idea of, I hadn't heard of the word paradigm until the Swiss watch industry stories used to get told, but that whole idea of being locked in a paradigm, I think, is incredibly powerful, and has been proven to be so. And so, it is certainly one of the big reasons why this sort of shift hasn't occurred. You then also it's hard to do as well, and you need belief-based decision making, not fact-based decision making, for people to step forward and start this journey. The belief, in my view, can be well founded on looking at analogous examples from other industries, but you've got to believe they hold true. And you get some very, very sophisticated arguments against the idea. I love the one that says, you cannot amortize the cost of a perfect design across one project. You need to be manufacturing millions of things to amortize the cost of design across a large volume. And it sounds quite compelling as an argument, right? I mean, it's well stated. It's stated by intelligent people. But actually, as I said earlier, you look at the design and redesign and rework activity that happens for not doing that, and actually, the cost of those things will be far more than offset by perfect design. Of course, one of the things we've come to believe too, though, is if you want to design a 50-story building down to the thread on a screw, you probably need to get into automation of design to make some of that happen. But as soon as people hear automated design, they think patterns, they think very common same buildings that there's a sense, well, we don't want our cities to look like Leningrad, we want them to look beautiful, so we reject this premise that we can just make this like manufacturing because we want everything to look different. But I say, well, look at cars. They don't all look the same. And we're deeply convinced that you can have beautiful, bespoke, designed things applying the principles of manufacturing in key ways to drive massive efficiency. So productivity premium, a safety premium. When I started in the steelworks in 1977, we killed a person a week. The last death on that steel plant was in 2008. Industrialization, has many benefits. And so you see productivity, you see safety, you see sustainability as well. So what you will see is as manufacturing is done, I mean, look at the price of a car. Many studies done on how little the real price of a car is lifted despite the improvement in quality and featuring and everything else, right? So you get that premium in sustainability with material science evolving and so on. Safety, sustainability, productivity, quality of the product. Automotive manufacturing in the UK went 1,000% quality improvement in the 90s through the application of total quality management principles.
Right.
Japanese auto went 400% productivity over 13 years from 1960 through total quality management principles. Lay down a systemic, repeatable way of working, then start improving.
Right.
And I think often because people can't conceive of the end game and think we're here now, we have to flip to this, it also rejects some of this premise because that change just looks too extraordinary. But the reality is other industries have taken 40 years to make the same sort of shift. So it's very hard for anyone to simply conceive of this. I guess it takes people as old as me to believe that 40 years might actually happen, and you'll be here to see the end of something that started in this era. But I've now been around industry in the world and been observing these things long enough to have seen some of those shifts occur and to have seen many companies pay the consequences of not seeing these shifts occur. So
and when you talk about those shifts, well, no, so I mean, there's so many similarities with what we're seeing at the moment, just as a result of what's happened over the past 4 or 5 months. I think about education, and that hasn't changed in 2,000 years, and the industrialization of that, and the reasons for it, and then how that has just been flipped on its head because literally now you can't have those students in the same classroom as your teacher. And then you look at the other constructs we're stuck in about companies not trusting a workforce to be remote, and so it's taken something, obviously, hopefully it's not like what we're going through now to create that shift, but there has to be something that is gonna ignite that and to push it. So if let's just say something does happen, there's a shift in some kind of geopolitical environment, something causes it to happen, it sounds like everybody will benefit from the solution, but who might drive it and who might benefit most from it? Maybe that's an obvious question after we've gone through it.
No, well, look, it's again, the numbers of dimensions in this, and I just want to pick up on what you said about what it took for perhaps people to challenge the thoughts around remote working or the nature of schooling. I've long held a thesis that it's only for companies, it's fear of death that will be what it takes to drive change.
Yeah.
And so unless that's there, it's very hard for companies who otherwise think they're being successful to go through the pain
Right.
that it takes to change. And there are companies inside the industry today who are brilliantly positioned with positional assets, who do investment in property development construction. Not many. Lend-Lease is an example of one of those,
Yeah.
who have all the ingredients and all the reasons to drive and accelerate the change. But so often industrial companies, the forces in the industry do live inside the company as well. And so, you see those challenges to change. So, it would not be unreasonable to suggest that the challenge will come from a couple of potential areas. One, just outside. Kateria started their company. Mark started the company on the basis that, the industry's a mess and we're gonna blow it up.
Right.
Now, they haven't cracked it, all right? And there'll be, I think, be many theses written on the Kateria story in the years to come. And I'm not saying they've failed yet, but they've certainly got a long way to go. Right? It hasn't been the overnight success that I'm sure many hoped it would be. There's a lot of money being thrown into that company. And, we'll all have our thoughts about why that's been a challenge. So it'll either come through a disruptor like that, who just jumps in and says, I'm going to do this different, Uberize the industry in the way Uber did to the taxi industry.
Yep.
Or it'll come from companies who perhaps start at the simple end of the product set and prove the discipline and the theory and then bring it forward. And there's one company that we got to know through a lot of the work we did over the early years, based out of the north of New Zealand, who transformed shed building, big industrial sheds, and taken taken their 40-year-old company of sub $10 million turnover to one of 4 or 5 times the size over the last few years.
Right.
And an industry that makes 3 to 5% margins and turn it into a 50% margin play in the lowest cost, highest quality, faster delivered sheds. It's a very simple product. Design your shed in 15 minutes online, get a fixed price quote, get all the parts delivered in 30 days, you're done. Get it assembled by a franchise partner to that model. But it proves it's a beautiful demonstration of the principles that will eventually be what happens to building 50-story high-rise buildings.
Right.
And so it could come in the same way as gaming invented a lot of technology for transformation in industries, or aerospace previously perhaps was where a lot of that innovation came from. People coming in from a tangential place in the industry, or from a simple product set that they then take to scale at the big end, or from a consumer product that becomes an enterprise product, or an enterprise product that can be scaled down to become a consumer volume product. Those sorts of shifts are where you see change come from as well. So I think an industry player at the simple product end, or a transformer, they're the two ways it could happen, other than one of the big players in the industry really switching this on and getting it right. And as I stand here today, I wouldn't predict which one of those it will be. And it's a good debate for the pub.
For sure. Yeah. And the benefits, once that happens, what are they gonna experience, and financial benefits? If a CFO, what are they gonna see?
So they're the obvious ones, and I touched on productivity, quality, safety, sustainability. Obviously, the customer benefits. The world, it's not overstating it to say that the world benefits, right? Concrete is the second most consumed product on the planet, and is 8% of the world's carbon emissions.
Right.
If you come to fabricatable concrete substitute style materials into this industry, those sorts of things, polymer type products and so on, are being worked on today that see 75-80% of the carbon emission in that product disappear. You're talking about 6% of the world's carbon emissions right there in one thing. So customer will get his home more predictably, at a more predictable cost, at higher quality finish. This has all happened with cars, right? the world will see a more sustainable industry. We'll be able to build cheaper homes, so the whole affordability issue starts to shift. We'll apply principles of modularity and other things to lower cost into a system of work that can cope with those sorts of innovations progressively. So there's a broad range of beneficiaries to this. And this is the $13 trillion industry on the planet. It's arguably the largest industry on the planet. So little wonder that if we find 1,000% productivity and quality improvement in the next 20 years, there'll be a lot of people who benefit. And I think the returns on this are enormous over time as this industry shifts into this mode.
Right. And for the project manager watching this, listening to it, head of project controls, director, what kind of things? It seems such a big elephant to take a bite out of, but what are the things that they can be? Is it education? Is it coming up to speed with it? Is it just seeing how you can apply the challenges that they've got today to get those wins, which see immediate benefits, low hanging fruit? What is it? What is it?
So it's interesting, because there's two ways this change is going to happen. I think there are those leaps, those transformative leaps, and certainly if an outside industry player comes in or a company turns on a product type where they're just going to go, we're going to change the way we do business there fundamentally overnight on this project. You'll see, people will have to be inducted into that mode of working. But for the evolutionary change that's occurring, a project director that says, I have a project plan that has all of our work activities tomorrow for ourselves and all of our supply chain partners, and we work together to collaborate around ensuring we all collectively get our jobs done, is transforming many belief systems. So, you talk to many construction executives and say, no way my project plan should have my subcontractors' work activities in it, because otherwise he's going to blame me for getting it wrong, and so even those kinds of steps are pushing the envelope forward around this idea that if you bring more collaboration into this industry, if you take away combative supply chain management, we're the last industry on the planet that still believes in that, right? Strategic supply chain partnering has been a factor in most other industries for a long time now, although, right. Supply partners to retailers might not really call it partnering, they might call it something else, but it's an orchestrated process in collaboration, right, by agreement. And this industry doesn't do it. So for the project manager, I think, yes, turning their head to these things. And most project managers have relatively high degrees of autonomy on their project. It's a very project-based industry, so they can try things and have them done differently. It's true, and is part of why the industry has found it very difficult to change systemically, because projects are quite independent. And just because I did it on this project doesn't mean it automatically will get done on the next one, because there's no system of learning in the industry in the way that manufacturers have done and so on for many years, using fundamentally the principles of TQM. And so, whether that's design thinking or theory of constraints or zero defects by Crosby, I mean, there are 10 or 12, methodologies around effectively the same thing, that are where you get systemically repeatable ways of working as a foundation for then improving systemically.
Right.
And any project manager that can lay down, collaboration through his supply chain, that can move to a more trusted collaborator and agreed upon design that's used as an authority to document throughout the chain of work, I think is making really important headway down this path. But they will often be fighting against elements in their own organisations who would discourage them from doing some of those things. So they need to probably find pockets where they can do it quietly to build their own confidence and belief in the power and the value of these things. But they will be ready then with their own stories to adopt these changes over the next 20 years, as they inevitably, in my opinion, do happen. There are too many green shoots now, I think, to think that this will go away now. I think we are finally seeing something that's been predicted in my papers back as far as the 80s. But yes, it's still not a painless journey.
And you mentioned the methodologies there. We talked previously about maybe the perfect example, the 777. We've spoken about the examples in the car industry where they're taking these engine blocks and pulling them into these different chassis to make a completely different product really for the market. If people were looking at any resources, where would they be going to immediately? Apart from those obvious things, where else could they be going to actually make that change on their project when they during the contracting strategy development phase, during the planning design phase? What other resources do you think?
Well, there's some academic and other industry bodies who are starting to switch on to these principles. So, for example, in Australia, there's the Building 4.0 research program now that we instigated with support of government and some industry partners. Okay. only late last year, right? That we were awarded that work. It's about $100 million worth of investment in these ideas over the next 7 years. And that's, public domain, government money, publicly accountable. That'd be a great place to go and sort of understand what people in there are doing and connect with people and people who are connected to that to see a way potentially through some of this, right? But the guidebook is not written in this industry yet today, and hopefully the Building 4.0 CRC will be one of the efforts that lays some important foundations for where this will go. But I think about people like Shop, the architecture group out of New York, who've been architecting for fabricatable structures,
right?
Kit parts based structures for years now, and so there's a network of people around the world who've been believing in this idea for a long time. There's a firm, and I'm sorry, the name just escapes me, in San Francisco, who created, and I'll look it up for you, but who created an institute now, Project Management Institute, fundamentally founded around these sorts of ideas.
Right.
And again, you talk to any of these people and they felt like lone warriors for a long period of time. But I know when we were doing a lot of the spade work to get our thinking straight, and that has connected a lot of the people who've now come together in the Building 4.0 program, and Shop Architects are inside that program as well, just by the way. We found a community of true believers around the world who could see this and were railing against the machine, doing what they could to move this forward, but in an industry that hasn't yet built momentum around this change and this idea. But as I say, there are many green shoots, and you're starting to see that, McKinsey, I think if you just track their writings over the last 3 years, as they've really turned on to this, there was the seminal paper back in 2017 in February, I think it was, and they've written a number of things since. There's a very good one very recently as well. They're making a louder and louder and clearer noise around the transformation and the inevitability, the need for and the inevitability of that. So there are numbers of places to connect with, I think, and if you start with any of those, you pretty quickly find most of the others, because most of them know each other by now.
Right, small group. Brilliant. Well, Bob, so you've had a fairly significant shift in your career over the past 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe a month or so. So what is next for you? What are you looking at?
Yeah, I'm working that through. It's been an interesting journey coming out of Lend-Lease. 2 weeks ago, I came out of Lend-Lease finally, officially, right. And but I'd started some conversations prior, and I'm at a time 43 years into my career, right? And one possibility, I guess, if the right corporate gig came along, I'd consider it. Although as every day goes by, and I'm working with some of the people I'm working with at the moment, it's becoming less and less likely. Of course, most of the headhunters don't put 61-year-olds on top of their hit list either. So that problem might solve itself. I've been approached about a couple of board roles. Right. I don't feel like a board sort of guy, but I am doing some board credentials at the moment just to have that available to me. But the core idea I'm working on at the moment actually is with some really interesting guys, one of whom's done M&A work for years, but very connected in sort of mid-enterprise, $50 to $500 million companies. Okay. And we think the sector play in construction property is one stream that makes a lot of sense, because I'm convinced that the transformation of that industry over the next 20 years is going to create many opportunities for many people. It's going to see investment in technology grow asymptotically and so on. So I do think that's one space collectively between the M&A, what I know as digital, and one or two of the other guys who got working with us might bring is interesting. But one of the guys, for example, set up the micro-lending economy in the Philippines, is very well connected here in Australia. He's got a heart for Indigenous people in our country, as all of us who've come together do. And we believe in self-determination, self-sufficiency of those Indigenous peoples. Australia's record on Indigenous peoples probably as bad or worse than anyone else in the world still. We're the only country whose Indigenous people aren't represented in our constitutional Bill of Rights. And he also set up a micro-lending marketplace and a company called Many Rivers in Australia for those communities. And so between our connections and our various paths, my career in corporate and in the digital space for 40 years, and we're already having some very interesting conversations, from helping fund startups to help direct strategy for startups to help mid-size, $200-300 million companies get their head around what they do about this digital thing. Right. I've got some work happening with one company looking at grant money to support them in their pursuit of automated design in a manufacturing context. So, that's an interesting adjacency to some of what we've been thinking about in this space, but in a more bespoke end of the manufacturing sector. Automated designs happen with large repeat manufacturing products, but not so much at the more job shopping end. And so it's a fascinating place I find myself in, with some fascinating people whose values I love, and when I had my own business, one of the things I really noted about mid-sized business entrepreneurs is, they come in all colours of the rainbow, not just shades of grey. Corporate forces you to be a little bit more shade of grey, just the nature of the beast. And you just get more done more quickly. There's less bullshit, right? Yep. And so I do enjoy that space, and it could be where I spend my next 10 or 15 years. So who knows? We'll see what comes. I've committed. I'm making no long-term commits for 3 or 4 months just to see what the world brings along. And it's an interesting 3 or 4 months to be seeing what the world brings along, of course. With the macro context we're in. But yes. And then we'll see. But it's nice, when I came out, I know it's a long answer, but when I came out of my prior life before going into Lend-Lease, I was chatting to people for about a month, and every conversation people were asking me about my age and whether I still had energy. And when I was kind of fearing that as I came out of Lend-Lease and thought, I'm going to start talking to people. But, it hasn't come up once. It's been none of it. It's very interesting, 6 years on, that's been far less prevalent than it was 6 years ago. So I don't know how to explain that one, but that's been a relief, I've got to say. I've enjoyed the interactions I've been having and the possibilities that are opening up. So we'll see what happens.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're looking forward. Hopefully you can come and join us again and give us an update as to what you're into. So what we're trying to do on these podcasts, try and ask you a little bit about any books you'd recommend, or maybe what you're reading at the moment, or any podcasts, or anything that you would like to just pass on to the people watching and listening.
Oh dear, I read. You're
smiling. I'm looking forward to this. You're looking like you.
No. I unashamedly spend most of my reading time reading mystery or murder mystery novels, right? Okay. Fiction.
Yeah.
And every now and then I'll bog in and I'll read a business book because someone recommended it strongly, or the boss decided everyone should read it. Measure What Matters. Measure What Matters. I had my whole team read over Christmas. Good book, just around the disciplines of setting your KRAs and driving outcome-oriented management focus that well supports the idea of agile working as a business beyond just doing agile technology. But I still, as a business book, I still go back to Good to Great, and I go back to the chapter on leadership. I guess, I stayed in the corporate world not because I love corporate, actually. There are two things about corporate that I think are great. One is, if you can get a change to take root, there's a massive power in that to change big things. And secondly, it's a great opportunity to help people realize their potential. You get that kind of support in a corporate context, and time and expectation around development of people. And so the people thing and the leadership thing and building great teams is what's always interested me. And, of course, there's so many issues you could talk to around the lack of diversity, the women's issues around, really haven't seen greater participation by women since almost the 90s, after the 60s to 90s took place. And I love the chapter on leadership in that book, and I encourage anyone to read it. I still think it stands up. Good to Great, the premise was they found 11 companies through a sort of first principle piece of analytical work, who'd been in a sector for 15 years and performed at about peer rate to the market comparators for 15 years, and then went through a point of inflection and for 15 years performed at 3x or more of their peers in the market. So it created they found 11 companies, and then they studied a number of characteristics around, well, what happened that made that difference? And one they talked to was leadership. And the findings on leadership are surprising. I'll leave it for people to follow that up, but I think it's a great dissertation. It should encourage anyone to understand that you don't have to be, charismatic and loud and ego-driven to be a leader. In fact, quite the contrary was true of the leaders in those organisations that made those sorts of shifts.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, excellent. And what about one of the mystery books? What about one of the that was a good business book.
Look, I'm a sucker for the Reacher series. I'm reading the Mitch Rapp, American Assassin series now. There's a whole series of books done there.
Excellent.
So, these are not great literature, but I do enjoy them.
That's what we love. Brilliant. No, I really appreciate it. Hey, Bob, just an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Reece. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.